I'm getting ready to build a nightstand for my daughter, and I'm in the stock sorting and preparation stage. Now in many videos I'll skip over the stock selection and preparation of a project, but this time I thought I'd go into a bit of a deeper dive. So I'm going to go through the consideration and thoughts I have when I'm designing a piece and laying out its dimensions, and then I'll step you through taking the lumber from rough to ready. So on screen right now I'm showing you the nightstand that I'm planning to build, and it's taken a bit to get to this step. Back at the beginning, you know, we do an image search online for nightstands. That gives us inspiration and ideas that I want to then fold into my project. We compare dimensions and features of some of the other nightstands that we have in the house. We use painter's tape to mark out a square to match the size of the top that I thought that we might like, and then my daughter looked at that and, you know, she put her lamp on it just to see if it worked. And of course we doodled ideas on paper. And from that we figured out we wanted something about 26 inches tall, and the top would be about 22 by 17. My daughter did not want any open shelves nor a bunch of drawers. So it's going to have just one drawer at the top, and then the rest of it's going to be a cabinet with a door on it. So I took all of that and I massaged it into my favorite CAD program, and the result is something that you're seeing up here on screen now. But even then, my daughter wasn't 100% sure she was going to like it. So I took it one step farther, and this is something that I rarely do. But I took the design and I drew it out life-size, 1-to-1 on this paper. So it is 22 inches tall across, it's 26 inches tall, and then I drew in exactly as size the drawer face and the door front, and then I cut it out and I gave it to my daughter, and she took this paper up to her room and she positioned it beside her bed and pondered it for a while. And yeah, we're gonna go with this. So then it was back to the computer, where I added a whole bunch of dimensions and notations to my plans so I could print them out and actually start the building process. So the lumber of choice is cherry. And I've just pulled out all of my stock of cherry, and I mean all of it. So the shelves up in my garage are now empty, and I've emptied my shop shelves of anything of a reasonable size. Now if you're a pen turner, your idea of what's a reasonable size of lumber is probably different than mine. I'm building a nightstand, so for me it needs to be at least about 3 inches wide and at least about 2 feet long before I'm going to consider it a reasonable size. Anything smaller than that is just, I'm not really counting it or wanting to deal with it. And at this point I'm actually concerned that I might not have enough cherry. I mean, it looks like a lot. I've got about 23 board feet. But you know, we need to cut around knots and defects and things like that. I don't know about you, but I always find I end up using more than I thought I was going to. I've heard people talk about sort of like a 10 to 20% wastage of, you know, for cutting around knots and just working with widths and stuff. I've never made any sort of scientific estimate of how much extra wood I need. But anyways, what I like to do is I lay out all my wood and I'll measure it, and then I'll draw this in my CAD program. So I'll draw this as if it was one big chunk of wood, and then in my CAD program I'll lay out my pieces, and that'll help me know, it's like, do I have enough, and also where am I going to put the pieces. So for this project I've got roughly 29 inches by 96 inches of cherry boards, and then I'll draw that out in CAD, and then I'll start with the biggest pieces. So I'll lay out the top, and then the side panel and the side panel and the panel for the door, and then I've got the drawer fronts and the door styles and so on, and hopefully I have enough that I can do the shelf and the bottom panel as well. And when I lay it out like that in the computer, of course everything fits perfectly, and you think, oh sure, you've got enough wood. But first of all, this assumes that all the wood is equally attractive, and it's not. You know, I'm going to position pieces so I have the most attractive grain. And yeah, this is some pretty nice cherry, but I do still have a couple of knots that I'm going to have to work around. And of course, you know, these are individual boards which have to be jointed and edged and all of that. And in the computer, I just drew it up as one big slab. Now, I do have a few other extra pieces that I did not draw, so I think I have enough, but I'm actually about to meet my buddy and head out into the countryside to visit my sawmill. So I might come home with a bit more cherry later today, but it's nice to know that I think I did have enough. So it's a fair bit later since that last scene, and I'm now at the stare at the wood and figure out where I'm going to make the first cut stage, which can take a while. And yes, I did buy a little bit more cherry, which you can see some of it back there. And I also tested this wood for moisture content. And I did that in a few spots, and I drill a few holes into the wood and put the moisture meter in, and it came out at about 7% in both spots. And I also tested the new wood as well, and that also came in at 7%, so it's really quite dry. So I want to do the big pieces first. So the top and the two sides, those are the largest pieces in my project. I want to get them done first because that way you pick out the best wood for that. And since I bought a bit more cherry, that does give me a little bit more leeway, which is good because I would really like to make each piece from one board if possible, or at least the show face, the top, and the front. I'd like to make those from one board. Here's a little step stool that I made about 10 months or so ago. And this is made from cherry. And look at that stripe down the middle. This is all cherry. This is cherry, this is cherry, this is cherry, but they were assembled from scraps, and so they're not from the same board. And I put this out in the sun to catch some UV, and it's had, 6 or more months to age, and that stripe still is very distinct from this stripe or this stripe. So even within cherry, you're going to get variations. So when you have a showpiece, a show face that you really want to emphasize, if possible, try to get it from the same tree, which I can't do because I'm buying wood from a lumber yard. So I don't know that the pieces are coming from the same tree. So then I try to take that one step further and take them from the same board if I really want to have consistent color across the panel. So future art, jumping in for a minute. I was just editing that previous clip and I realized that some people are going to look at this and they're going to say, oh, you're just getting mixed up about sapwood. Well, I don't think I am, but regardless, for the sake of argument, I took out my cell phone and I took some footage of our coffee table, which is made of cherry. And as you start at the one end, you can just see the cherry boards are all nicely blended, but as I pan across to the other end, this one board gets paler and paler until you get to the end, and it does not match at all. And that's my point. Even within cherry, you're going to have variation of color. And I think I've explained that enough. So what I'm trying to do now is pick out the wood for the top or the front. Let me explain. These are all nice pieces of cherry, but this board really speaks to me. These are all fairly uniform in color and grain. This one has got a lot more interesting stuff going on. So on the negative side, there's a knot there and there's a knot there, whereas the rest of these boards are virtually knot free. However, this piece has also got what I find to be these interesting color streaks in the grain all throughout the board, which I think are going to look quite interesting when you get it planed and finished. All that to say, I really like this board and I think it's the best of the four. So I've been debating, do I want to cut this up for the front? Which will be tough because I've got like a door with little skinny bits and then a panel and then a drawer, so it'll be kind of hard to do that. Or do I want to do this, dedicate this one board to the top? The negative of that is, of course, the top of your nightstand gets covered with stuff, so it might not always be the most visible, but at some point you just sort of have to make the decision and go with it. And I've decided that I think I'm going to use this for the top. So I need a piece 17 by 22. This board is just a hair under 8 inches, so I'm only going to count on about 7.5 or 7.25 finished width. So 2 of these is not enough. I'm going to need a third because I need 17. I'm going to measure 22 inches along, but then I'm going to add, say, another 3 inches at each end for possible snipe. So that takes us up to 28. So I'm just going to round up and I'm going to cut this right there at the 30 mark. And moving from there along the board, we've got this knot. So I'll be able to use, say, this amount for another section of the top. That brings us to here. And then down here we have another knot that I want to avoid, but luckily we have almost 30 inches before the knot. So this will provide a large chunk of the top, the other end will provide a large chunk, and this piece in the middle will provide a smaller chunk. So that's how wood disappears quickly, because it looks like this will give me enough for the top, but nothing else. Maybe a little bit here I'll be able to use somewhere else in the piece. Use my portable circular saw to break this down into those 3 pieces that I need. And then the next step is taking this to the jointer and the planer, but first I'm going to rough cut out some more pieces. But because I really want to keep these separate, I want to make sure I write on the edges what I want this for. So then I'm going to have to make sure I keep these things distinct from the other parts. Don't get them mixed up. So I've got these pieces on my table saw because it's a nice flat surface. And I can check how flat they are. And I need to do that because my jointer is only a 6-inch jointer. And these are wider than 6 inches. So I can see that it's rocking here. But if I flip it over, it's actually not rocking. So this should be flat enough to run through my planer as it is. Let's check the other parts. This one is also not rocking here. So again, this piece can go through the planer as it is. And finally, I've got this third piece, and that rocks. Both sides are rocking. But this is also the piece with the knot in it, so I think I'm going to take it over to my bandsaw and I'm going to rip it right there, and then I'll be able to put this piece over the jointer. Now in the case where the wood doesn't have a flat enough side to go through the planer, I do have this planer sled. I built this and used this in some previous videos. I'll put up some clips of it here. The idea is that this is a flat piece, and you can take your rocking board, put that on here, wedge it so it doesn't move, fix it with hot glue, and then you can run it through the planer. And when you get this side flat, then you can flip that over and do the other side. So in that way you can process a wide board even if it's too wide for your joiner. So next I took the piece with the knot and I ripped it smaller on the bandsaw, so it's about 5 inches wide now. And after trimming it down on the bandsaw, I just took 2 passes over the joiner. And now this face is flat enough that I can send it through the planer along with the other 2 boards for the remainder of milling this down to thickness. And then in the same way I sorted through and prepared wood for the 2 side pieces. Those are the next biggest pieces. They're 15 inches wide, 26 inches tall. This is from one board, and this is actually some of my new cherry. This was a sort of a grungy piece that I picked up, but I think it's enough wood for the side, and it also is, these are all nice and flat enough. And then here's a little spare piece that I might need for one of the sides to fill in a bit. This is from the scrap from the top, so that would be one instance of mixing a different board into a panel. But these are going to be the sides, mostly against the bed, not in view. And it might be interesting to just see what turns out. So the next step is planing, and that's often a big montage in most videos because it is a long process that is pretty boring to put on screen. Oh. So I let the camera run for 2 long sessions of planing where each board has gone through the planer twice now, except I forgot to push record on the camera. This is a non-professional filmmaker here in my basement shop. But anyways, these boards have gone through twice now, and the main point is that now this top is flat, and I will flip them over and proceed, and this time I'll actually put the record on so we can see one whole planing session. And that's enough for tonight. I planed everything down so that it is clean on both sides, and it's just a hair under 1 inch, a little bit more than 7/8. And I'm going to leave it rest overnight, and then tomorrow or the next day, depending on my schedule, I will do the finish planing, and then I will move on to gluing these up into panels. So for various life reasons, I ended up leaving that wood to rest for probably close to a week, and it has not moved at all. It is still flat and a consistent thickness and no twisting, so I can now move on with getting these cut and glued up into panels. My boards are still rough on both sides, so I'm going to start with taking them to the joiner to clean up one edge, and then I will rip the other side to width. So I'm going to work on the left side, the right side, and the bottom, basically all at the same time. I think like most of you, I generally use a combination blade in my table saw, but I want a lot of very precise ripping here, so I am going to take a moment and switch out to my ripping blade. The letters are getting worn off, but that does say glue line rip. I wrote the date on it, so I know how long I've had it. Not on this one, though. And so with one side freshly jointed, I need to rip the other side so that it's parallel. And yes, the glue line ripping blade really does leave a surface that is good enough to go right to joinery. So not sponsored, it's just a great blade. And yes, combination blades can give you a great surface also, but the ripping blade just gives you one that's just that much better. Now is when I like to pause and spend some time laying out the boards and deciding what I think looks good together. And really, I want to try to make this joint disappear. So I'm trying to see how the grains look. Like here, this is really good. I'm probably going to end up using this, but let's flip it end for end. That also still looks good. That's also a good one. Let's try. So here I don't like it because this is fairly wide grain. Here it's fairly narrow grain. But yeah, if I flip those like that, that looks quite good. So I think this. And then I'll take my pencil and I'll just do some scribbles across so I know how to line it up again. I need panels that are 15 inches wide, and my planer can only do up to 13 inches wide, so I need these to be perfectly in alignment. I'm going to use dowels for alignment using my Dowel Max jig, which I love. No, this is just for alignment. This is, in this case, this is not for joinery or strength that way. If you had a domino, you could use dominoes for alignment, or a biscuit joiner, or if you're just really, really good with using clamping cauls to get a perfect flatness. I'm pretty good, but this is cheap insurance for a little bit of time. With the Dowel Max, you use this alignment bar for as you move the jig along a piece. Other tools like the domino, you can just draw a pencil line. There's a little bit more side-to-side wiggle with those jigs. With the Dowel Max, there is no side-to-side wiggle, so you need to be precise. So that is one thing that slows this down a bit. A little dry fit. And I can see how these dowels will keep this in perfect alignment because the top is absolutely flat. One thing with dowels is that you need to remember to put a pencil mark everywhere you place a dowel so that you don't accidentally cut through it with a saw later. Don't ask me how I know that. Normally with dowels, I'm careful to put glue on them because they're part of your strength, you know, they're like tenons or such, but now they're just for alignment, so it doesn't really matter, but I'm probably still going to put a bit of glue in each dowel hole just out of habit and consistency. I don't want to develop the habit of forgetting to do that. Get a nice little bit of glue squeeze out all the way along, and more importantly, these things are totally flush. After the glue up, I spent some time sanding the 3 panels, and then the 2 side panels I cut to finished size on the table saw. I next took the 2 sides and I decided which was going to be left and right, because then I needed to mark where I want to take a rabbet along the back edge of both panels for the back of the cabinet. I'll be using a stacking dado blade for that. You could use a router table or router also. This is a little fiddly to set up, but once it's there, it's all nice. If you have one, you need to take out your splitter before you use your dado blade. Use a square to set the height of it to about 3/8 of an inch, which is, half the thickness of my panel. And then next I have a sacrificial fence, which I will place over top of the dado blade. And I've got these clamps for clamping it into place on my table saw fence. This way I don't really need to worry about how thick the dado blade is, because I can adjust the actual thickness of the cut with the fence. So the blade is embedded in this piece of plywood. Then I'll use a piece of scrap to make a test cut. I made a few adjustments to the fence and to the height of the blade until I got a rabbet that I was happy with, and I tested it with the plywood that I have chosen for the back. And I'm making a fairly deep rabbet because I'm not 100% sure about the back. I might use something different for the back than that plywood. A large panel might lift a bit when you're running it over a dado blade, so I'm careful to push down with this push block on top of it, and I just ran both pieces twice. I then measured and marked for the cabinet feet. I'm going to round the corners, so I'm going to use a Forstner bit to first cut that out, or drill that out. So with the side panels ready, I want to move towards getting it assembled, and so I need to work on the inner structure. I've already glued up something for the bottom shelf, but I need to make this square frame here where the drawer is going to rest on. And for that, I prepared some 2-inch stock, and then I cut them to length on the table saw. And I'm going to get my dowel jig out again for doing the joinery on these corners. I just drilled 3 dowel holes just because there was room. It's really kind of ridiculous. 2 dowels per joint would be plenty. One of the nice things about dowels is it will really mostly lock itself into a square joint as long as you've properly prepared the wood so that all the mating surfaces are square and flat. So let's check the corners. 22 1/4 that way, 22 1/4 this way, so that should be square. So these are all the parts of the carcass of the cabinet. We got the 2 sides, we got some cross pieces for at the top, and then I have the drawer frame and the bottom. Now the drawer frame and the bottom were both cut a little bit oversized, and now that the sides have the dados in them, we will cut them down to exactly match the sides up into the dado. These will line up with the dado in the back. So the cut we just did was for setting the depth of the pieces, so they perfectly match the sides. I next set a stop block on my panel cutting saw, and I use that to cut all the inner structure of the cabinet to the exact same width. And this cut is for setting the width of the inner structure pieces so that they are all identical. This is one of these situations where it doesn't matter if I'm a little bit more or a little bit under the measurement. What matters is that all 4 pieces of the cross structure are exactly the same. So I'm cutting them all with the same cutting operation. And then drill pocket holes in all of the inner structure pieces. I'm going to start at the bottom for assembly, and to help with that, I've ripped these 2-inch wide spacers to help line up the bottom with the bottom of the cabinet. A little bit of precision here will help ensure that the cabinet is put together nicely. I want to make sure this is flush here with the bottom. I've got it clamped together. I'm going to take the bottom panel and run a little bead of glue down the middle of it, and then bring it right up against that spacer. And then here at the front, that's the key part. I want this to be smooth at the front, or rather, I want it to be flush. And the little clamp that holds it to the spacer, again, just want everything to be really nice and precise. And finally, I don't want this shifting at all when I start screwing, so I'm going to add a clamp also, just holding it tight. Still need to add a couple screws, but I'll just take this out now and double check that everything looks good. Yep. Then put in the last 2 screws. The top cross pieces can be held in place with this Craig clamp. But again, a little dab of glue first. Use your fingers to just feel that everything is flush as it should be. And with 1 screw in place, take out the clamp and put in the other one. I ripped another piece of scrap to 4 inches. This is for setting off the space for the drawer support. Again, first a little bit of glue, clamp it into place. And I'll use my long reach clamp to get in here and hold it down in the middle. The other side's more of the same, except more stress because I'm doing all 3 at once. So I'm going to try to make sure everything is carefully lined up, and I'll probably practice once first before I commit. And I'll probably use less glue because I might end up having to shift things around. So this has to be lifted and dropped like that. Yeah, after some thought, I'm just going to skip the glue on this side and just depend on the screws. I think there's going to be a little bit too much shifting, and it's just going to end up smeared all over the place. When I've got the back on it, that'll hold everything really solid also. Do a little fiddling to get this into position. Double check that. And now let's get this spacer clamped into position. And there we go. First time all together. Kind of. I then measured and cut a piece of sanded fir plywood to go on the back. So the screw holes up here are going to be covered by the top, so you're never going to see them. And the screw holes for the bottom are under the bottom, so you're never going to see that. These screw holes are almost invisible, so I'm not that worried about them because they're on the underside. But I'm still going to put some cherry plugs in the 2 front holes on each side. I bought this pack of plugs years ago. They're made by the same company that makes the pocket hole screw in the jig, and they're made of cherry, so they should blend in, and they are sized in such a way to fit into the holes that we have drilled. They stick out a bit now and we'll sand them flush later. And yeah, they mean it's impossible to get those screws out now. And after the glue is dry, I get a flush cutting saw, which has no set on the one side, so you should be able to just cut like that without scratching. I'm a little paranoid, so I'm actually using a little piece of paper just for a little extra space. And you're just gonna have to be patient, because this is a slow process. Of course, my saw is not the newest, so it's probably a bit on the dull side. And the result is really nice and flush. First, I'll try a little chisel work, but this time I don't think I need it. When you consider that this is the bottom, so it's almost never going to be seen, the result is really nice. So the next step was to go back to the beginning with lumber selection and cutting and jointing and planing, and I've already shown you that in this video. And I use that to make the top that's going to be going on, as well as a shelf to fit into the cabinet. The top is going to stay loose for quite a while. I'm not going to attach that until after I've got all the bottom structure dealt with. We want the shelf to be adjustable, so I'm going to use one of these shelf pin jigs to put in a bunch of shelf pin holes. This one's by Craig. There's others out there, or you can, just get a piece of wood and drill some holes in it. I want 2 rows of holes in here, and I think I'm going to lay it down, as that'll make it easier to get the drill positioned. The way this jig works is you have a drill bit with a stop collar on it. The collar, of course, will limit how far your drill can drill through the jig into your workpiece. And the result is a series of evenly spaced holes like that you then put your shelf pins into. So I don't need shelf pin holes right down to the bottom, so I brought back the 4-inch spacer, and I'm going to use that to space the jig up from the bottom of the cabinet. And unfortunately, I should have done this before I put the back in. It would have made filming a lot easier. So I'm going to be trying my best, but I'm probably partly blocking. And then I have another spacer. I just picked one that seemed to work out. Double check with the shelf in there. And that, do I want it that way? I want it that way. This is closer to the front, so it should be easier to film, but one thing to remember is these spacers that I put are just loose, so I'm holding the jig firmly with my other hand. There we go. And then flip it over and repeat the operation for the other side. Here we go. One removable and adjustable shelf. Nice. I've prepared some 1/2-inch thick maple stock to use for the drawer, sized to just nicely fit into the drawer opening. The drawer bottom is going to be some more of that sanded fir plywood that I used for the cabinet back. And I've put my 1/4-inch box cutting blade into the table saw, and I use that to run some test cuts, and I'm going to cut all the slots in the sides of the drawer to hold the drawer bottom. The box cutting blade leaves a nice flat top, so I left that blade in the saw, and I set a stop block here in my crosscut sled, took some test cuts, and then used that to make rabbets at the end of the 2 side pieces. There was some careful measuring of the opening, and then careful trimming, and then measuring, and then trimming to get the pieces to fit. And I almost forgot to cut the back piece shorter so that the bottom can slide over it. I will reinforce the joints later, but I'm going to start with just a little bit of glue. The plywood will go a long way to holding it square, which is why I want the plywood in while I'm putting it together. I actually wasn't liking how the clamps were arranged, so after I turned off the camera, I quickly took it apart and I rejigged it so the clamps are underneath it on this side and over top of it on that side. And I still had to add one here to pull the one corner, but it is now nice and square. I'm using a contrasting wood dowel for reinforcement, so I've measured and marked the joints for holes, and then I'm going to drill and then glue the dowel into place. When the glue is dried, I'll chisel and sand these flush. So all that's left now is the drawer front and the door. And like before, I prepared some stock, but I want to show you again the thought that I gave to grain selection and layout. So these are all the pieces for the door and for the drawer front. And if you think they look similar, they do, because all of these were cut out of one long board. So they all have similar grain coloration, so these should all finish similarly. And for the panel for the door, again, I cut this. This is just from one piece of cherry. This is actually a fair bit lighter than this, but it still has a really pleasing grain pattern, and I managed to make the seam down the middle basically disappear. These are all still oversized, and I've just been working on laying out the actual door itself. So I was having some glare and focus issues with the shiny tabletop, so I've put this darker backdrop, and let me try to bring the camera into nice focus. These are the two pieces that I picked out for the side, and if you'll see here, they sort of have a book matched or a mirroring of the grain that I quite consciously took. These are, again, these are all cut from the same board. You know, if you had something like that, I think it would look weird, because on one side the grain would curve this way, but on the other side the grain would curve that way. But this is of course going to be separated by the panel, but just giving some thought to how I have the grain effect. And I've given some of the same thought to the bottom and the top piece. Nice straight grain that looks good together. All right, I hope all that movement didn't make you seasick. So here I've got the pieces laid out again. And for instance, here I've just drawn a scribble on the front, and I put a tape so that I'm marking what's going to be the inside. And then here I'm just running a pencil mark. That's where I will be cutting the groove that the panel is going to fit into. And I'm doing the same on all of the pieces. I'm putting a piece of tape to mark the front, the show face, if you will, and then I'm drawing a pencil line on the inside so I will remember when I'm over on the table saw which way I'm cutting. The drawer front was pretty easy. I just trimmed it to match the size of the drawer and forgot to turn on the camera, but that just nicely goes into there, and then we will be attaching that to the drawer box. For the door, I decided to do a traditional raised frame and panel using stub tenons, and so I've been practicing making grooves down the middle of my pieces. For that, I set up the table saw again with the 1/4-inch box joint blade, and I will get them exactly down the center by running each piece twice, reversing it afterwards, and so that way the slot will be perfectly centered. The door width is pretty critical, so I've placed the two vertical pieces just inside so I don't have to do any math, and I'm just going to measure that. So I need 11 5/8. Now this slot is a 1/2 inch deep. I got to take that 11 5/8 and add an inch to it. So I've set a stop block to allow me to cut 12 5/8 here. And you better believe me that that was a nerve-wracking cut, because if I get these lengths wrong, then the entire door is ruined. The next step was to start working on the stub tenons. And again, this is a time when you do a lot of test cuts to be sure that what you've got is going to fit. For making the raised panel, I'm going to be using a vertical panel raising bit. They're not terribly common. I picked this one up a couple of years ago, but as you see, it makes a pleasing profile. And again, one of these times where you want to make some test cuts because you mess this up and you're starting over with your panel. I'm taking repeated light cuts, and after each cut I need to move the fence a little bit. You can always cut more, but you can't cut any less. And after a few passes, I had what I thought was a nice raised panel on the front. The rest of it was still too thick, so I put the dado blade back in the table saw and I relieved the back. And it nicely fits into the groove now. Some of you may be wondering why I'm not using a horizontal panel raising bit. Fair question. I don't have one. That's it. A lot of my past projects are in the shaker style, and for those, I use a flat panel for the door. Time to get this together. I made the sides extra long so I could adjust the length later, but for the grain patterns, I really wanted the door to be at this end of that. Oh, the tiniest bit of squeeze out there. Pretty good. Yep. So full disclosure, this is actually my second panel. I managed to mess up the first one and made it too thin for the slot, so I had to go select wood and plane and cut and joint and just make a whole nother one. But it was actually a happy little accident because this new panel I think is a much better color match for the rails and stiles. Well, the sun was shining today, so I took the top and the door and the drawer front and I got them outside for about 4 hours of UV exposure. Now, unfortunately, the next 7 days have no sunshine at all, and I want to get this thing finished, so we're just going to have to press ahead. So I'm going to have to be patient and let this cherry darken at a normal pace instead of jump starting the process, but maybe next spring on a few sunny days I'll still put this outside to catch a few more rays. A quick bit of table saw trimming brought the door to its finished size, and I then attached the drawer front to the drawer box, and so the drawer is pretty much finished also. Need to fix that. So the drawer goes too far in, but I knew that was going to happen. In fact, I did it on purpose because I certainly didn't want it sticking too far out. And the way to fix that is just push it all the way in, and then I will measure the gap here and then just make a block to fit. And we'll take that and we'll tuck it in the back, and then I will glue it in position. And now the drawer is nicely flush. So it's just a little more. We're ready to start applying finish. I'll be applying a coat of shellac over everything, and I'll follow that up with my favorite water-based oil-modified polyurethane. After that, there was a bit more measuring and drilling as I attached the handles and mounted the hinges and finally attach the top. It's attached underneath with screws, and I did use elongated holes to allow for wood movement. One other thing is I added a little stop block inside the top of the opening here to give the cabinet door a positive stop. And that's about it for this project. I want to say a big thanks to everyone who stuck it out to the very end. I hope you learned something or at least enjoyed the journey. If you have any questions about my project, please drop them into the comments section below, and we'll see you on the next one.